In the talks of most iconic watches in the world, there is absolutely no chance you can miss a Rolex GMT Master 2 and a Submariner. These are not just the watches that have maintained their iconic looks and signature aesthetics over the period of many decades, but they are both also historically so rich with the heritage and the prestige that you can talk all day about each of them. While both the GMT Master and the Submariner were originally made to serve a profession, with the GMT being a watch for pilots to be able to track a second time zone, and the Submariner being a watch for professional divers to be able to time the dive. Rolex have continued to evolve and improve these watches over the period of time, where today both of these professional watches do stay true to their function and specifications. They come with the attributes of jewelry, precision, workmanship, quality and aesthetics. And they in today's world are both worn mostly for pleasure, prestige and those jewelry characters. So while they are completely different watches for the experience on the wrist, they have many common attributes as they are both Rolex professional watches. When we say these watches share many common attributes, it's easy to spot what's so similar between the two. For example, both watches share exactly the same dial shade and the glossy texture. Both watches share exactly the same shape for hour markers and the dial layout. Both watches come with a Cyclops lens, and then both watches have a ceramic bezel that is virtually scratch resistant and will not lose its color. Both watches come with a crown guard, and then there's a screw-down crown. Both of these watches come with a printed crown on the dial between the text Swiss made just below the 6 o'clock hour marker. Both watches also come with an oyster bracelet, but the GMT does come with an option for a Jubilee bracelet, whereas the Rolex Submariner only has one option of oyster bracelet, as in this video. Speaking about the differences on the dial, while the text below the 12 o'clock hour marker is the same on both of these watches, the Submariner comes with 4 lines of text above 6 o'clock marker, whereas on the GMT we have one less line of text. The GMT naturally comes with a 4th hand in the dial, which is there to read the second time zone. In the Pepsi configuration, the GMT hand is red, as in this video, and in the Batman, the same GMT hand comes in blue. Speaking about the dial hands, if you notice closely, the Mercedes hour hand on the Submariner is much more pointed and narrow at the tip as compared to the hour hand on the GMT. And then while the minute hand is very slightly larger on the GMT, the seconds hand is ever so slightly larger on the Submariner. If you further notice closely, the Lume circle on the seconds hand of GMT Master is also slightly bigger than that of Submariner. I will discuss this more in the Lume shot later in the video. As Rolex increased the size of the Submariner last year to 41mm, the GMT continues to remain a 40mm watch, and it is worth comparing their sizes measured by a caliber to see and gauge the actual differences in the size. The size measured on the outer extremity of the bezel on the GMT is 40.3mm, and measuring the same on the Submariner, the size is 40.6mm. So while Rolex market the GMT as a 1mm smaller watch than the Sub, the difference on the face of the watch is only 1/3 of it, that is 0.3mm. To compare the size of the dial, I've measured the size of the crystals on top on both of these watches, and we have a 29.8mm crystal on the GMT, whereas on the Submariner, the crystal is 29.7mm. Allowing some human error in the readings, it is safe to say that the size of the dial on both of these watches is more or less the same. How the watch wears on the wrist is estimated from its lug-to-lug height, and measuring the same on the GMT it is 47.8mm tall watch, and measuring the lug-to-lug on the Submariner, it is exactly the same and returns the reading of 47.8mm. So looking at the size of the case on both of these watches, while they are marketed as 1mm different in their sizes, for all intents and purposes, and for how large or small they would wear on the wrist, they are both more or less the same, and you'd be pushed to find a difference in their sizes, even when they are side by side. The bracelet is wider on the new Submariner 41, and it comes with a 21mm wide bracelet as opposed to the GMT, which has a more conventional 20mm bracelet. The bracelet on the Submariner continues to remain wider, and it tapers down to 16.5mm at the clasp versus the GMT, which tapers down to 15.4mm at the clasp. The width of the clasp on the sub is also wider, and it is 18.6mm versus the clasp width on the GMT, which is 17.6mm. So due to a wider bracelet, the Submariner does look more substantial and chunkier on the wrist compared to the GMT. The GMT does also come with polished center links and brushed side links, whereas in the Submariner, we have a more tool form with the bracelet and the clasp that are all brushed and have no polished surfaces on the top side. To compare the thickness of both of these watches, the GMT Master measured on my caliber comes at 12mm as opposed to the Submariner, which is 12.3mm. So the GMT is a slightly thinner watch of the two, and the difference is hardly noticeable. What's interesting is that if you look at the thickness of the steel case below the bezel, the Submariner case side is thinner by about ½ millimeter, despite the fact that it is a 0.3mm thicker watch of the two. So what is it that makes the Submariner eventually a thicker watch? It is the case back that protrudes out further on the sub compared to the GMT. Another point to note here is that while the new Submariner has had its lugs trimmed down to give it a more conventional profile and looks, the all-new GMT continues to remain in a relatively chunkier case, which in the Rolex collector's world is called as super case. This is a similar case with wider, or let's say broader case lugs, as was the case with the ceramic 40mm Submariner that this 41mm sub replaced last year. Putting the watches in the dark, both watches come with a lume that is bright and beautiful. The lume on both of these watches is also very similar. But as I pointed earlier, while the hands and hour markers are the same on both of them, if you look at the lume circle for the seconds hand, the GMT has a larger size of the two. The Submariner on the right comes with a lume pip on the bezel, and the GMT on the left has a lumed fourth hand for the GMT. I left the watches in the dark for another 5 minutes, so while GMT is a relatively newer watch, the Submariner maintained the brightness better, which is aligned with its diving function and specifications. And Rolex rarely disappoint on the professional functionalities of their watches, and so is the case here as well. On the wrist, the 40mm GMT wears beautifully with those blue and red tones on the bezel. It fills the wrist beautifully, and there is no sense that it is a small or a large watch for my wrist. Rather, it looks very proportionate. The shiny and the blingy elements on the GMT do make it more suitable watch for formal or dressier occasions, and then the bracelet does complement the overall blingy elements of the watch. On the other hand, the Submariner 41 wears the same on the wrist as the GMT, largely because it has the same lug-to-lug, so to say that it wears larger is a merely false statement. That being said, since it has a wider bracelet, it does look more chunkier and adds more heft to the wrist, but not at the cost of wearability. The bracelet is also all brushed, so the Submariner is rather more suited for casual and sporty occasions. But that is not to say that it can't be worn for a dressier occasion. Both of the watches come with flip-lock safety clasp, but where the GMT comes with a 5mm easy link and the micro adjustments, the Submariner takes the bracelet length adjustment flexibility to a whole new level and has a glide lock mechanism, which makes it such a versatile watch that it can virtually be worn by two people with different wrist size without the use of any tools at all. Rolex GMT Master Pepsi and the Submariner are two of the best Rolex professional models to exist in the flesh. And if you compare these two based on their strengths or weaknesses, there really is no winner or loser between the two. They are both completely different watches in terms of their functionality and specifications, with the GMT having the capability to measure the second time zone with a bidirectional bezel, and then the Submariner with a water resistance of 300 meters to make it a professional diving watch with a lumed pip on a unidirectional bezel. In terms of their aesthetics, wearability and sizes, they are more or less the same, with both offered with ceramic bezel and a case size that, regardless of whether you call it a 40mm or a 41mm, wears on the wrist exactly the same. The Submariner does look more substantial, but that's due to a wider bracelet and not really the case itself. For all intents and purposes, they are both amazing pieces that are completely different in terms of their looks and experience on the wrist. So I don't think you are watching this video and comparing these to decide which one to buy, rather to decide which one to buy first.